Sometime in your career as a software engineer, you're going to be asked if you're interested in being a manager. This can happen very quickly. For example, I was asked to manage in my first year as a software engineer in industry, or it can take decades. But should you? Managing a team is fundamentally different from being an engineer. It uses a different set of skills, many of which you've probably never had any experience with. So how do you go about deciding whether you would enjoy being a manager and whether you'd make a good manager? Hi, I'm John Miller, the Deliberate Engineer. I spent the last 30 years working as a software engineer at places like Microsoft, Amazon, Google, and a variety of other places, including academia, government, and research. I spent 13 of those years working as a software engineering manager. My first career job was working at Microsoft as a software engineer in test on Windows NT 3.1 in the early 90s. Now, when I joined the team, it was about 40 people total. By the time I left a few years later, it was more than 400 people. That amount of extreme growth also led to extreme opportunities, and I was invited to become a manager in my first year. What's the life of a manager like, and what makes a good manager? I'm going to focus on the second one today because I already made a video about what managers do early on that talks a lot about what the life of a manager is like. A manager's job is all about planning, communication, and prioritization. There's some technical work as well, but this tends to be about reviewing things that other people have done and providing some overall guidance rather than doing any of that technical work directly yourself. Still, a manager should have some first-hand experience doing the technical side of the job. Without this experience, it's going to be much more difficult to be a good manager. Someone who's already shipped a product and had to go through the various parts of the product cycle understands viscerally what it means to be an engineer, and this can lend insights into managing other engineers. If you don't have that technical background to begin with when you become an engineer, then you're going to have to find someone you can trust, ideally a senior engineer who's going to be able to do those technical parts of the job that are more difficult for you as somebody who doesn't have the experience. So when you're considering being a manager, either make sure you have the requisite experience or ensure you're comfortable finding a good technical person and leaning on them for those parts of the job. If you are a strong technical person, make sure that you're going to be comfortable giving up that part of the job. In other words, delegating and supervising people who are doing the technical work rather than getting to do any of the really interesting and important technical work yourself. If you can't, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but you should probably stick to being an individual contributor rather than moving into management. Delegating effectively is harder than it sounds. As a manager, you'll need to delegate both the very interesting parts of the job and the very mundane scut work that everybody has to get done. Depending on the person, you might really enjoy getting rid of all that scut work and not having to do too much of it, or you might feel bad about it and have real trouble letting go of those pieces. You don't really have a choice as a manager. There's a lot of different things that consume your time, and there's only so much you can take on of the onerous tasks that fall under the team. So things like scrubbing bugs or taking a look through logs to make sure things are working okay. All kinds of sort of menial tasks like this are things that you'll do what makes sense as a manager, and the rest you'll have to delegate. If you're looking at being a manager, you should enjoy talking to people and communicating. This winds up being the vast majority of what a manager does. A given manager has a huge amount of meetings. The least meetings I ever had as a manager was about 15 hours a week. A more typical load would be 25 hours a week, and at one point I actually had more than 40 hours a week of scheduled meetings. This was back in the 90s at Microsoft, so hopefully things have calmed down in industry overall. As a manager who's in meetings, you have to be used to getting your work done in the meetings. That's what you're there for. So you don't just sit there and play on your laptop doing random stuff. You're actually taking in information, making decisions, contributing to strategies, and so on. All of this requires your active participation in the meeting, so you really have to be an effective communicator and effective at participating in a group setting. All of these meetings impose an additional burden. In a single morning, you might go from having sensitive one-on-ones to planning meetings to status meetings, having to swap context in and out for each one of those meetings and try and give it your full undivided attention with enough context for you to be able to be effective. A technical contributor typically tries to minimize the number of context switches they do. They need a significant amount of time focusing on a problem. It's exactly the opposite for a manager. Your job is jumping around doing a lot of different things. You need to be effective at multitasking, and you need to be effective at compartmentalizing the sorts of things that are happening to keep them from bleeding over into each other. Good time management is another skill that you have to be an effective manager. You need to be good at having a feeling for how much time you're spending on things, how much time has passed when you're in a sort of unstructured environment, and being able to time box important activities. Another big burden put on to managers is trying to maintain and stay on top of their email and their asynchronous messages or synchronous messages, things like Slack, Microsoft Teams, and so on. You have to get good at dealing with the fact that you're perpetually behind and out of date, and being able to cherry pick the things that are important in these message streams, because typically there's going to be too much information in them for you to stay on top of. Now, as a side note, I've seen two interesting strategies for dealing with this, neither of which I was really able to do myself. The first is to limit your use of the messaging schemes to particular times of day. For example, first thing in the morning when you get in, first thing at night right before you leave, and once in the middle of the day, say around lunchtime. You work on the email either for a certain amount of time, like half an hour, an hour, or as long as it takes, and then you don't look at it and you don't touch it again until the next scheduled time you have. The second strategy is more of a prioritization strategy. The people who followed this never answered the first time a question was asked, never responded to the first mail they got from somebody on a topic. Instead, what they would do is assume that if it's important, they'll come back and ask again. This winds up, even though they wind up getting more mail, it winds up reducing the number of things that are asked for them. Because oftentimes when somebody brings up a question or an issue, they resolve it themselves shortly afterwards, and any time that the manager would have spent looking into that issue would have been wasted time. It's a pretty brutal way to work, but some people have been able to be successful doing this. Finally, as a manager, you'll need to be able to deal with some unpleasant situations as a people manager. You'll need to be able to arbitrate between a relatively limited set of resources that are given for promotions and for people to get merit awards, and decide who gets how much. If somebody's having problems, you'll have to take a look at that person and figure out, is this something temporary that's going to go away, or do we need to start something more formal? And you have to start documenting their behavior. As a manager, sooner or later you're going to wind up putting people on performance improvement plans or PIPs and monitoring them very closely. You may even need to let somebody go. All this is very difficult for anybody to do, and it's an unpleasant part of the life of a manager, but it's part of the job. Anyways, these are the main things that you should think about when you're trying to decide whether or not a management job is a good fit for you. Suppose you do decide to become a manager. What benefit do you get out of choosing this course of action? One thing that you get is more visibility and a broader scope. You get to see more of the things that are going on and be involved formally in more of the decision making. This gives you the ability to have more of an influence on where the product and where the company are going, which can be very valuable. And it's also possible to have this as an individual contributor, but typically individual contributors don't get this level of scope and influence on things until they're a principal engineer or higher. One thing you don't get out of being a manager is any more money or a faster path up to the top. As far as I can see, having been a manager for 13 years in big tech and having been everything from an entry-level junior engineer all the way up through a senior principal engineer, is that the amount of money you get paid and the speed at which you advance, really it's going to be about the same between the individual contributor discipline and the management discipline. Not everybody gets to advance all the way up in management. Not everybody gets to advance all the way up as an individual contributor, and the rewards are roughly equal as you advance between those two trees. Still, managing can be a rewarding career path if you have the aptitude for it and if it's the things you like, especially dealing with people, meeting and influencing things. In order to be successful as a manager, you do need to have some technical experience or aptitude, or you need to have a partner who has that experience that you can rely on. You need to have good communication skills, good planning skills, good time management and multitasking, and you need to be able to deal with the variety of stresses that come with being a manager. And of course, you should care about the people on your team and be okay with managing them, both helping them move forward and helping them improve if they bump into problems, or if worse comes to worse, protecting the company by helping them move on to another job. For what it's worth, I've often found that people who weren't making the grade of the company were equally unhappy, and they went on from that company after they left to have a more fulfilling, better career someplace else. If you've been a software engineering manager, does all of this make sense to you? Do you agree with all of it, or is there anything that doesn't ring quite true? Do you have any other things that you think go into making somebody a good manager or help them decide if they would enjoy being a manager? If so, please leave comments down below. I'd love to hear what you think. Thanks for making it through the video, and keep on pushing forward. Hi, this is John. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please think about subscribing so you get notified of my future videos. Also, if you are interested, you might want to check out the video I have linked here. Thanks, and keep on pushing forward.